Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. I want to tell the story of why Jesus wept. It's found in John 11 verses 1 to 44. Jesus had been preaching in Jerusalem. He then got news that Lazarus, the one he loved, was sick. And Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. Jesus said this sickness will not end in death, but it'll be for God's glory, so that his Son will be glorified. And though he loved the family, it was not yet time to go. Jesus stayed for 2 more days, even though his friend was sick. Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, and Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. Jesus sent his disciples, then left for Bethany. Jesus said, Lazarus is dead, let us go to him. I will wake him up so that you may believe, and give praise to God above for the act that had been done. And Jesus wept, and Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. When Jesus arrived there, Lazarus was in the tomb. He met up with Martha and began to talk with her. She said, if you had been here, he would not have died. But I know that you will give whatever you would ask. And Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. Jesus said to Martha, your brother will rise again. She said, I know that he will rise on the last day. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live though he dies. And Jesus wept, and Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. Jesus then asked her, do you believe this? She said, I know you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who was to come into the world, the one who came into the world, the one who sent from God. And Jesus wept, and Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. Martha then left Jesus and called Mary aside. She said, the teacher's here and he's asking for you. Immediately she got up and quickly went to him. When she had reached him there, she fell before his feet. Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, and Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. Mary looked at Jesus with tears in her eyes. She said, if you had been here, he would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, he was deeply moved. Then he asked Mary to take him to the tomb. And Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept, and Jesus wept, Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. While at the tomb, he was deeply moved again. He then asked for them to come and take away the stone. Mary said, he stinks real bad, it's been 4 days, you see. Jesus said, if you believe, then you'd see the glory of God. And Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. The stone had been rolled away and Jesus said a prayer. Thank you, Father, for hearing me. I know you always do. This is for the benefit of the people here, that they may believe and know that you have sent me here. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. When Jesus said this, he then said out loud, Lazarus, come forth! Out of the tomb, Lazarus came out, linens and all. Jesus said, take off those clothes and let him go home. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. And this is not the end of the story, you see. Jesus also weeps over you and me. He loved you so very much that he gave up his life, so that one day you could be with him in heaven for eternity. And Jesus wept. Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. And Jesus wept. John 11:35 says Jesus wept.